So everyone knows that if you're building a house, that you need to start with a good foundation, right? If you don't start with a good foundation, you're going to experience a lot of problems later, right? You might not experience problems starting out, but as time progresses and you put more things on the house or things start to shake up, not having a foundation can be a big no. It's a big problem, right? And so that's kind of what I'm going to do today. Chapter 40 marks another change of scenery in the book of Ezekiel. And for the next 9 chapters, we're going to be talking about a specific vision that Ezekiel has. And it really could be its own little book within Ezekiel. And because of that, I believe that it deserves its own foundation, right? And so that's what we're going to do today. I've titled this message, When God Shows Up in Details. And the reason I've titled it that today is because there's a lot of little details in this chapter, a lot of little measurements and different rooms and things like that, right? And so before we get into that, let's lay a foundation for this. So within this section of Scripture, I'll have to be honest, this was the section I have felt the least prepared for ever in my time teaching. Although it hasn't been that long, I still have felt the least prepared for this because it is just a very difficult chapter and section to study, right? But I did find great comfort knowing that a lot of these great Bible teachers that I listened to said the same thing, right? You get on and you listen to one of their teachings and they're like, yeah, so I changed my mind about when I taught this last time, I believe this or that regarding this matter. So I did find comfort in that. But for our time in this section, within this vision of Ezekiel, there's really two main interpretations of it, right? There is a group of people that believe that we are to interpret this spiritually and to interpret this as not to be taken literally, but we are to take this and apply it, that it applies to the Christian and the church and how they should worship in the future, et cetera, et cetera. The other approach to this is that it is a literal temple that will be built in the kingdom age or the millennial reign, the 1,000-year period after the Great Tribulation. We are going to study it the next couple weeks from that point of view. So we're going to look at it as a literal temple that is yet to be built, right? In doing that, the nice thing is you don't have to agree. You can still think it's a spiritual thing, and that's fine, right? But we're going to still find application ways we can glean from it today and in the future. So before we get into that, I want to kind of give everyone a little refresher of the kingdom age, the millennial reign, that 1,000-year period. And basically what we believe is that as Christians, that there's going to be a time where there's going to be a 7-year great tribulation and a time of judgment and pain, just good stuff. I hope I'm not there for that, but that's just me personally. And after that, Jesus is going to return and he's going to set up his kingdom here on earth, and he's going to reign for 1,000 years, and it's going to be great, right? There's still going to be things like sin and whatnot, but it'll be dealt with quickly. People are still going to be living life kind of as we know it. It's kind of what I look at as like a transitionary period from earth to heaven kind of deal. But people are still going to be being born, and there's just going to be a lot of good stuff that happens in that time, right? And so I believe that this temple, this vision that Ezekiel has, is of the temple that will be built during that kingdom age, right? We know from tons of other prophets that there will be a temple in the kingdom age and that Jesus will inhabit the throne of said temple, right? And I think that, because one of the main arguments is people who want to take this spiritually is they say, well, it hasn't happened yet. Or, the temple that they rebuilt after they were let go of captivity, that temple doesn't match this one here. Or the one that Herod built doesn't match this temple here. And when the Antichrist builds his temple before the tribulation and he takes the throne, it's not going to match this one here, more than likely. Right? So people look at that and they're like, well, if it doesn't match this, then it must be spiritual. Right? And I think as Christians, we get a little worried when God doesn't, do something right away. Kind of like this, like we get this idea that, because it hasn't happened yet, means that it must be spiritual. Right? So we might think like, you might get a word from the Lord that he's going to bring salvation to a family member of yours that you've been praying for a while, and it doesn't happen, and you start to think, well, maybe that was, maybe I was wrong, or maybe that application was different, or, whatever you might start to feel. But I want to encourage you that just because it's easy to spiritualize something doesn't mean that you're supposed to, right? Sometimes we need to continue having faith in what God has told us, right? And so I think that's the first thing we can take away from this is that, we believing it's going to be literal temple, we're going to continue having the faith that just because it hasn't happened yet, it is still going to be that literal temple. And so that is our foundation for these next 9 verses, or I wish, 9 chapters. But now we're going to see the setting of the scene, right? And anybody who's written a book or read a book knows how important it is to set the scene before we get into our story. So let's look now in verses 1 through 3. They'll be on the screen as well. So it says here in verse 1 to 3, in the 25th year of our captivity, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was captured, on the very same day, the hands of God took me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain. On it, toward the south, was something like a structure of a city. He took me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze. He had a line of flax, a measuring rod in his hand, and he stood in the gateway. So that's our scene, right? Before this, I want to just give another quick little reminder, right? The Israelites are still in captivity. It says here they've been in captivity now 14 years past the destruction of the temple. And it gives a date, right? So it says here that that this vision took place on the first day of the year. Now it's actually these details, these measurements we're going to read about are just numbers, right? We're like, okay, cool, like 6 rods long, like what does that mean, But we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the Israelite readers of that time. We have to, sometimes when we're reading the Bible, things don't make sense to us, but when we look at it in context of who would be reading it, we then understand it at a deeper level, and that's how this works. So because we believe that it was the first day of the religious calendar, that would put this at the beginning of the Passover feast, right? And so again, it's like, okay, cool. More than likely in their captivity, we've already talked about in Ezekiel, they wouldn't have been partaking of the different feasts. They wouldn't have been partaking of the Passover and whatnot. Because they're captors, Babylonians, they wouldn't let them. But the reason this is important is because the Passover feast was something that they did in remembrance of being let go from Egypt, of being set free from the Egyptians and their captivity in Egypt. So this vision is coming on the very beginning of their Passover feast. It would have been no coincidence to them, right? This would have been a reminder of, hey, I've already redeemed you once. I've already brought you out of Egypt once. And now I have a vision for you about a futuristic temple. All right? So to the Israelites, this date would have been very, very important. It would have meant a lot. Like they would have understood this date and been like, oh, that's pretty cool. I do remember. I remember when, I remember hearing stories. They'd be like, I remember stories from my grandpa used to tell me, I remember when, we got a Frosties, but it was called Blondies, and, all that's what it would have been like. They would have started talking like, don't you remember this? God, he brought us out of Egypt. And to them in captivity, it would have really, really meant a lot. Second thing we see is that God takes Ezekiel to a specific place. So he takes Ezekiel in this vision to a futuristic Jerusalem, and in the future Jerusalem, right? He puts him on this high mountain, and he's looking over, and he sees this temple and this city-like structure, but he knows that it's clearly Israel and clearly Jerusalem. And what we understand from this section is that Jerusalem in its current state is destroyed, it's desolate, it's ruined, it's trampled on by the feet of thousands of soldiers. Their buildings are burned to the ground, right? The land has been completely and totally desecrated. And what this is a picture of how God is not only going to redeem his people, but he's also going to redeem their land. He's going to redeem the land of Jerusalem, the land of Israel. The third thing we're introduced to is we're introduced into Ezekiel's angelic tour guide, his heavenly tour guide, if you will, right? And it's this dude with a bunch I imagine just like some dude rolls up and he's got a tape measure and like a yardstick. And he's like, all right, I got to show you some measurements. Like, get your pen and paper down, right? But he's covered in bronze completely head to toe. So definitely not a human, definitely angel. But he's standing in this temple. And so then the third thing we see is that God is showing them, hey, I'm going to redeem your temple. So within these first 3 verses, we see that God is a God of complete restoration, right? God doesn't restore you part way. He doesn't come into your life and just fix like, oh, I'm going to just kind of, I guess I'll give you back that. No, God is a God that completely restores his people. And we can take great comfort and joy in that. We can find hope in the fact that God does not do things halfway. It's kind of like the men's bathroom right now, right? It's halfway done. God doesn't do that, right? God would completely fix the men's bathroom. That's how it is. I mean, how many people here have projects that are like half done? I have a ton. Sorry, man, I'm going to get you in trouble. That's what I did this week, and I finished a lot of those half-done projects and then made more. But God is a God that completely restores. He doesn't leave things half done. And so this message to the Israelites, to us, it's like, okay, cool. But to the Israelites, it would have held great hope. They would have found meaning in this. They would have found joy and comfort like, hey, God hasn't forgotten us. Mind you, it's been, in this book, it's been 14 years between the last chapters. So there's this big span of time where we're missing things, right? And so we have to imagine that they're getting pretty in captivity. They're not a good place, right? The Israelites need some hope, and that's what God gives them here. And this is really the first clue that we're going to see that God is a God of details, and that details matter to God. And so let's look at a call to details in verse 4 through 5. And again, it'll be on the screen. It says this, "And the man said to me, Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears, and fix your mind on everything I show you. To the house of Israel, everything you see. Now there was a wall all around the outside of the temple. In the man's hand was a measuring rod, 6 cubits long, each being a cubit and a handbreadth. And he measured the width of the wall structure, 1 rod, and the height of 1 rod." So in this section, there's a command, right? There's a command that's given to Ezekiel that he is to fully pay attention, that he is to fully devote all his senses to the understanding and the recording of the details of this temple, right? That's what it says, that the reason why he was there is that he might show these things to Ezekiel. He was there for one mission and one mission only, and that was to see these things, hear these things, and fix his mind on everything that he's seen. And I want to slow down and I want to look at some application that we can have, because I'll be honest, in these next handful of chapters, the application is few and far between, right? I mean, there's only so much you can pull out of, that's 6 cubits long, and so is that, and so is that, and so is that. But that one's 7, so do with that what you will. He says here, look with your eyes. And I love this command because we live in a day and age where I feel like we're not really looking anywhere with our eyes that's good, right? There's a lot of bad things to look at, right? We get distracted. How many people walk down the street on their phone, right? Looking down at their phone. And there's a commercial out where it's like the car companies have understood that like they need to make commercials. And in this commercial, this dude is walking on the street in the crosswalk with his phone, and the car, it's like a thing because the car can sense that people are stupid and stop or something like that. And it's like, we put this safety feature even for him in there, and then the guy looks and he's all mad at like the car, like, yo, you almost hit me. That's how we are, right? I mean, we are oftentimes so oblivious of everything that's happening around us. But oftentimes the Lord sends us people that if we don't see them, we can't minister to them. If we're not focused on those around us and we're too focused on ourselves, then we're going to miss the opportunities that the Lord is sending us, the people that he's bringing our way. Right? So we need to open our eyes, both spiritually and physically, to the details around us. Because I believe that every day God gives us the ability to be doers of his word and to love on people around us and to see the hurt, the broken around us, or to choose not to. To be so caught up with us that we neglect those around us. The next thing he says is he calls them to hear with your ears. The second way we can be attentive to the details around us is to be good listeners, right? Now we know that being a good listener is tough, right? Because we want to listen and we want to, especially if you're a guy, you want to listen and you're already thinking of, this is what we can do to fix this. And how many times has your wife or your girlfriend or whatever been like, I don't want you to fix it. I just want you to listen. There's a difference between listening to listen and listening to fix. And in this section, I believe that he's telling Ezekiel, like, hey, don't listen like you're listening for one specific reason, to understand. And then I want you to write everything down. Right? So as Christians, it's very similar. When we see that person with our eyes, and we go up and we're talking to that person, whether it's after church or at work or school or here or there, we're having that conversation with them, and we're talking to them. Are we listening to them, or are we listening in order to respond to them? And you're like, well, how can I not? If God put him in my path to help him, how can I not listen to respond? Well, the third thing is to fix your mind on everything I show you. This is arguably the most important thing. Ezekiel was supposed to see and hear everything, to fix his mind on it, so that he might then what? Take this information to the Israelites. His goal, what God had him to do, was to give this information specifically to the house of Israel, is what it says. Meaning that God was going to be the one to help him remember And I think that's key, because in those situations where we're ministering to people, where we're loving on people, we aren't supposed to be listening with this hope that, oh, I know what to say now. No, you don't know what to say. You're listening and you're saying, all right, Lord, I've heard him. What do you want me to tell them? I'm listening to this person. I understand their needs. I have a deep understanding of their problems, not just a small, somewhat understanding. What do you now want me to say to them? That is what God is showing desires of Ezekiel. And that's what he desires of you and I. Right? God had a message of restoration and comfort to the people of Israel through this plans, blueprints for a temple. And there's going to be times when the Lord has a message for you to give to someone else. But if you're not paying attention and if you're not looking in the right places, you're going to miss the person that you're supposed to minister to, or you're going to miss the message that you're supposed to give them. I can't tell you how many times I will listening to a song or reading a book or at a church service, whatever it may be, and something is said or done, and I'm like, that's awesome. Like, oh, that's totally for me right now, blah, blah, blah. And then I go home, and I'm going about my day, and someone comes along, and they be like, man, I'm really struggling with this. And I'm like, oh, I guess it wasn't for me. Well, here you go. This is what I heard today, and it really helped me. Right? That happens so much more than I think we realize. Right? That's part of fellowship, that, we fellowship with one another to build each other up. Right? God gives us certain things that are for you, but even more than that, they're for the people around you. Because God didn't set up Christianity that we just kind of mind our own business and take care of ourselves. He set it up that we would be with each other, that we'd fellowship with one another, that we would encourage each other. And that's his perfect desire for us and for this section here. Now that we've seen why the details matter, we've set the scene, we've laid the foundation, let's look at some details in measurements. So John, you can go and throw that picture up if you wouldn't mind. I don't know if you can see this or not. It's kind of small. But I want to talk about why I believe that this is a literal temple. The first reason is you can literally take the measurements that are given in these chapters and you can create a literal blueprint for the temple. So there's a bunch of people that have taken the measurements in here and they have created those, and they almost all are identical, right? So to me, it's like, why would he go through all those details if it wasn't intended to be a literal building that was created at some point, right? If it was just to be spiritual, I don't see the need to get in depth with all of these details, right? And so I'm going to start reading here in verse 6, and I'm just going to give you a taste. We're not going to read the 39 verses of measurements. I just want to give you a little taste, and then if you are so inclined to read them, I would recommend just Google Ezekiel's temple chapter 20 or 30, 40, and that will pop up. And if you want to read it, I would do that. I would take your phone and read out all the measurements and stuff, and you can look at your phone while you're doing it, and you're like, oh, okay, that was kind of cool to do that. So it says this, then he went to the gateway which faced east, and he went up its stairs and measured the threshold of the gateway, which was 1 rod wide, and the other threshold was 1 rod wide. Each gate chamber was 1 rod long and 1 rod wide. Between the gate chambers was a space of 5 cubits, and the threshold of the gateway by the vestibule of the inside of the gate was 1 rod. He also measured the vestibule of the inside gate 1 rod, Then he measured the vestibule of the gateway 8 cubits, and the gateposts 2 cubits. The vestibules of the gate was on the inside in the eastern gateway, where 3 gate chambers on one side and 3 on the other side. The 3 were all the same size. Also the gateposts were of the same size on the side of that side. That was 4. I hope you didn't have to sign that, Caitlin, because that would have been rough. That was four verses. And you got to think, there's another 36 or something of that. That's just a taste of the details that went into this vision that Ezekiel was supposed to pay attention and write down. Right? So, the second reason, I mentioned the first reason I believe that this is a literal thing is because, why would they go into great detail? There's a taste of the great details. The second reason is later in this, around verse 38, there's mentions of tables for sacrifices, right? And sacrificial instruments and et cetera, things like that. And this is the big area where people who believe it to be spiritual are like, okay, why would you need sacrifices if Jesus has already died on the cross and returned and he's sitting on the throne? Fair point. And they say that because of this tables and stuff and the sacrifice equipment, this must be spiritual. I believe that this actually bolsters the argument that it is literal. And the reasons behind that is just the same reasons we take communion today. Jesus has already died on the cross and risen, but we still take communion. And why do we take it? But in remembrance and memorial for what he did. It is simply an illustration that we use to encourage one another and teach other people about Jesus' sacrifice. And so these sacrifices, we believe that would be the same purpose that they hold in that kingdom age. For those 1,000 years, there's going to be kids being born that experience nothing. Imagine how trippy that would be to be born in that time period, and you're just like, what? What did I miss? And they're like, well, let me tell you what you missed. You missed a lot. But it would be, that's how they would go about doing like communion. It would be a way of illustrating Christ's sacrifice to the people around him. And so they wouldn't be sacrificing for redemption purposes. That's already been done. But they would be sacrificing to show people, to illustrate, and to do it in memorial of Jesus' sacrifice, who would be there on the throne. And so it would be a great honor to do these things for him, saying it's a form of worship. And so that's what I believe with that, right? I just think there's too much detail and proof that this is a literal temple that's going to take place. So then that leaves us with this, like, what do we do with this? Right? What do we do with these 30-something things about archways and gateposts and measurements? Like, how does that apply to us today? Right? What do we... And honestly, in reading that, I was like, dude, I got nothing. I'm like, and then I started thinking about it. I was like, well, that's because this doesn't apply to us today. Right? This is something that is futuristic. Right? It hasn't happened yet. But then again, I'm reminded to the people, the readers of this section, this would have meant so much. Right? Again, the Israelites would have found such great joy in this section because the temple at one point was the heart and soul of the people. David spent years and money and everything collecting all the things, and everything was perfect. They rebuilt the temple after this because it was so important to them. Herod's temple that was built before it was destroyed by the Romans was considered one of the greatest wonders of the world before it was destroyed. It was really their pride and joy, right? We remember that even in the rebellious state, they thought that, we're super rebellious people right now, but God would never destroy his temple. They thought that they could do anything they wanted, they could profane it however they wanted, but because it was God's temple, that God would not destroy it. But as we know from earlier chapters, Ezekiel also had a vision of God's presence leaving that temple. And then what happened? It was destroyed. The very thing that at one point they held so dearly and thought was indestructible was turned to rubble. The very resting place of God. The place of restoration where they would sacrifice and they would become clean. A place of worship. It's easy to take things for granted when you have them. Right? We're very lucky because we can meet in church freely. We can pray freely. We don't have to go to a temple to pray. We don't have to pray to get forgiveness for sins. We don't have to go to a temple. We don't have to give a sacrifice. If we want fellowship, we can do that freely. And I think as Christians, these are things we often take for granted because we have them freely. And we can understand that there might be a time when we don't have these things freely. And we look back and we're like, man, we really didn't take advantage of that. For them to experience the presence of God, they had to go to a location and do all these different things to experience God's presence. And even then, they didn't even fully get to experience it. But in today's age, all we have to do is speak. If you want to speak with God, all you have to do is speak with God and pray. If you want to hear from God, all you have to do is read his word. If you want to have fellowship with one another, all you have to do is have fellowship with one another. And just like these Israelites took things for granted, I think we run the danger of doing that ourselves. And so we need to be careful making sure that we don't take for granted these joys and these things that we have right now. Because there will be a time when we more than likely don't have them. That's a very real possibility we live with. But this message of all these details to the Israelites, to them what it would have been said is, hey, do you remember when you were in captivity to Egypt and I brought you out? That's what it started with, right? Yeah. Well, I'm going to do that again. And not only am I going to do that again, but I'm going to redeem you guys completely. I'm going to take you from captivity to Babylon. I'm going to redeem my people. I'm going to redeem the hearts of them. Not only am I going to redeem them, I'm going to restore them back to their land. I'm going to then restore that land. And then I'm going to restore my temple. All things we know happened from the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so in their time of captivity, these details would have brought so much comfort and joy to them to be reminded of the simple fact that God hasn't left them. And that God is a God of details. And we so often get in that rut of man, God forgot me. He's putting me through this trial. I coach boys basketball at Bret Hart, and we were at a game yesterday. And we lost to a team that, frankly, we should have beat by 20. And it's a sucky feeling. And after the game, the kids were in denial, and they're like, we didn't lose to them. And I was like, no, you definitely lost to them. You can say you didn't lose all you want, but you definitely lost. Like, that's an L on the sheets for you guys. Sorry. And they were just in such denial. Like, we didn't lose. And, I just sat with them and I was like, guys, look, it's a tournament before the season even starts. This isn't even preseason. This is preseason. It's like, this doesn't matter. Your goal to make playoffs, this doesn't affect this. What this is I told them, this is a stepping stone. This is a learning experience. You made a lot of little mistakes that cost you the game. But this game is a learning experience, and you can choose. You can keep denying that that we lost this game, and you can stay where you're at and say, or you can get over it and say, you know what? We lost. We learned from it. I'm taking the next step forward. And that's what you have to do. Right? And Christianity is so much like that. We're going to have times where we feel like we're in captivity, and it's like, God's like, no, you're not. All you have to do is just accept the fact that you screwed up and ask for forgiveness, and with me, let's take the next step forward. Let's learn from our mistakes and let's grow. That's what he's asking us to do. That's what he's asking the Israelites to do is, hey, let's take the next step forward. God desires that we don't deny the bad things that happen and the circumstances we face, but we embrace them and we trust the details of his plans. Because he has plans for our lives. And the enemy wants us to think that, he doesn't care about us or that he doesn't have plans for us, but we know that he has plans that are great for us. Constantly, all throughout the Bible, he talks about how he has just joys and blessings for his people. But oftentimes we don't receive those blessings because we are unwilling to admit to our own downfalls. We are stuck in a captivity that's not really there, and the enemy takes that and goes, oh no, you can't receive those blessings because you're stuck in that closet. And I would encourage you guys, whatever lie you believe, whatever lie you're believing right now that's keeping you from the blessings of the Lord, understand that lie holds no power. I read this book, and this guy, he tells a story about how him and his coworkers would mess around with each other, and they'd play pranks on each other. And one time he locked his coworker in a closet. He shut the door. And he's like, let me out. And he told his coworker, he's like, nope, I'm putting a chair in front of the door now. And he tried to jam a chair under the thing so he couldn't get out. He tried to literally lock him in there. And the chair didn't fit, right? So then he put the chair away, and he goes, all right, the chair's under there. You can't get out. You're stuck in there. And then he left and went on with his day, figuring that the guy would just try and open the door and walk out. And he never did. So then the story goes on. He fell through the ceilings in his office, and this is a crazy story, right? But I love that illustration, because what it shows us is we think that we're stuck. We think we're locked by the lies we choose to believe, right? We choose to believe these lies about ourselves, that forgiveness isn't available for us because of what we've done. So then we just live in the closet. We live in that dark place where the light can't shine. But those lies, the enemy, there's no power there. He wants you to think it's the illusion of power, but it's not there. Because all you have to do is open the door and you'll find it was never locked in the first place. And you can step into God's blessings. And that's what the Israelites were learning there. All throughout the book of Ezekiel, the Israelites are learning the hard way that they need to step back into God's blessings. They had turned from him. They had profaned him. And all they had to do is step back into his blessings and his promises. And so whatever you're facing today, know that there is no power on earth that can keep you from the blessings of God. All you have to do is step into the light. That might mean accepting Jesus for the first time. And if that's what you feel you need to do, we have elders here that'll be standing. And if you feel the need to go accept Jesus into your life for the first time, go talk to one of them, and they can walk you through that. If you feel that, you just need prayer for something, for forgiveness, and you want an elder to pray with you for forgiveness, go talk to them. But don't leave here in the same state that you arrived. Don't leave here still bound by the things that aren't real.